Welcome to the President and CEO Focus on the Middle Market podcast series, where President and CEO founder Paul Stugel discusses middle market issues with business leaders from across the nation. Today, Paul speaks with Australian entrepreneur Jodee Rich, founder and CEO of PeopleBrowsr, about Jodee's interesting background and the future of middle market CEO networking.
Jodee, I gotta ask you. I mean, I looked through, and I put this in the email to you. I looked at your profile, which was absolutely brilliant. I literally belly laughed throughout the whole thing. really quite amusing. So, Jodee, tell us about your time with other 8-year-old cannibals and your fish tank business when you were young.
Well, it's all true. We had a tiny little house completely in the middle of nowhere on a beach in New Guinea. My dad was running a timber mill, and we were left to play on the beach with the village children, some of whom were literally the children of cannibals. And then as I got a little bit older, I actually got to meet the mums and dads. And what entertained me, and the reason I included it in my LinkedIn bio, was on some days I feel like my whole life has been spent being chased by big, scary, hairy men who were trying to eat me. And it all started at the age of 8.
Have they caught you?
Absolutely not. In fact, I'm getting better at running the fight. and we're seeing some real structural change in the internet, and there are some big, hairy cannibals in this space that we may well end up doing battle with.
Well, why don't you expand on that? I mean, the first of all, the structural changes in the internet. Obviously, the domain expansion is a pretty significant event.
So, most people think of the internet as .com, and the internet is about to move from being .com to being many .anythings, and that's going to bring about huge focus around interest groups and community, which is really exciting. The industries that have attracted me in my life have been industries where there have been big dominant players who have typically enjoyed their lives under the protection of some regulation or some market structure that allows them to be monopolies. And what's extraordinary about the internet is that it is actually powered by 3 dominant players, 3 monopolistic players. VeriSign are the suppliers of .com, and they have enjoyed huge market share over the last 10, 15 years. Then downstream, GoDaddy is the major retailer in the space. They claim to have over 50% market share. And then we have a regulator, ICANN, who has had extraordinary powers to not only style the product in the industry, but also the distribution channel. And what's striking is that in my view, all 3 of those entities are going to go through enormous change over the next few years. VeriSign is going to suddenly move from a place where they have very, very little competition to enormous competition, and .com is going to become many different things. GoDaddy, who are the big gorilla in the space, who have risen up because they've had some fun consumer marketing, are suddenly they're going to be in a place where they're now competing with the 2 biggest consumer marketers in the world, i.e. Google and Amazon are entering the space. And so that's going to change the market, and suddenly GoDaddy, the dominant retailer in the US, is going to find itself competing with Google. And GoDaddy think that they do a great job with small business, but guess what? I think Google and Amazon do an even better job with small business. So that's going to add enormous competition to this space, and I think GoDaddy is going to have to go through major changes to compete. And I'd be amazed if they are able to hold on to half of the market share that they have. And then ICANN, I think, is going to move from really being the creator to being a more traditional regulator, and I think they welcome that as well. I think that they will be in the business of promoting the new structure, and then to a lesser extent, hopefully, enforcement. So those that's going to be the major structural change. And then from the consumer's perspective, which is really the interesting part, is that there are only 250 million domain names in existence. And for most people, they just simply see that as an address right now. But my view is that very, very shortly, over the next year or two, consumers are going to realize that these new domain names can actually become their identity. And so I can be jodeerich.ceo. Scott can be scottmilner.golf. I can be Jodee Rich, the kite surfer, if I want to. And we can actually use domain addresses to actually say who we are, much in the same way that Facebook and Twitter have taught us to express ourselves publicly. We are now ready to actually put labels on ourselves and labels on our expression. And domain addresses, I think, are about to become domain identities. And if that happens, this industry will move not from 250 million, but to 1 billion or 2 billion domain addresses as people embrace the address as their identity.
Right. So I would be paulstukel.scotch, I think, is probably the way I would do it. Yeah, perfect. Yeah. Well, no, but in all honesty, I mean that's an element of my. I enjoy fine Scotch. That's something I do, right? And so I'm being only partially facetious here because it does lead into the .ceo concept. By having such a domain, I am then almost automatically part of a community of people who enjoy Scotch. Or in the case
exactly.
of .ceo, I am now almost automatically a community of CEOs. I mean, am I making that too simplistic, or is that kind of the idea?
I think that's perfect. That's absolutely perfect. And you're one step ahead of me in what you're saying is that we'll move not just from identity but to network. And so, Google and Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn have taught people over the last 5 years to search and to poke and to retweet and to like and express ourselves publicly online. And so now people are ready to express themselves with their own domain identities. And what we say is, .com was the typewriter days of the Internet. And a sort of a fun side story is that I said to my son when I was telling him a few years ago about what I was doing, I said, Sam, do you actually know what a typewriter is? And he said, Dad, it's what they used in the olden days to send emails. And I think that's exactly that. It's a wonderful way of describing what was going on back in the good old days, which is that everyone thought you could just get a .com. And then if you go back a little bit further, you can remember the days when you spoke at a conference and you said, who has an email address, right? And lots of people didn't have email addresses 10 or 15 years ago. I think we'll look back on these days as the early days of identity, and in 5 years, everyone will be, a Paul.Scotch or a Jodee.ceo or a Jodee.kitesurfer.
Right. No, that's interesting. It makes complete sense in many ways. I mean, it's a self-selection, and it will. The other sort of, and this is a very banal paradigm, but it's a paradigm nevertheless. Most of us identify ourselves with the first part. The prior to the .com identifies us. Either your name, with your address, with your company. So right, pstukel@nexuspublishing.com is me, right? .com.
Yep.
The .com is sort of a peripheral thing. Your identity is expressed through that, and you may have a few emails. I do. I have more emails than I should have, frankly, and they express different elements of my life. But this is actually going to the domain side, which the domain you will have multiple domains. I presume,
exactly.
I mean, unless you're a very whatever the word is, have a very small, very narrow perspective. There's a word for it, and I can't remember what it is, but a very narrow perspective. But I mean, most of us have different things in our lives. CEO is one of them. Scotch is one of them. Golf is one of them. Sailing is one of them for me.
Exactly.
So yeah, so then it's using the domain to sort of self-identify, and again, I'm restating things that I think you probably have already said. I'm just trying to make sure I understand. by moving it to the domain side, by moving it after the dot, I guess is the way I put it, you're then allowing networking, because you can't really network through the anything before the dot. You have to network after the dot. I'm not sure that's an artful way of putting it or not, but I mean I think that's kind of what you're saying.
The industry talks about it as right of the dot, and what we're saying is that right of the dot moves to be something meaningful. Right of the dot moves from being a generic term to something meaningful about you. And once that happens, we then can actually group people into communities. And once we group people into communities, all sorts of amazing things can happen, particularly with people who have learned about social network actions. And, I came across a fantastic site a couple of days ago called OilPro, OILPRO. And OilPro are one of the very, very first sites which is taking a group of people, in this case the oil industry, and creating a social network just around them. And so what we say is that these new TLDs are creating opportunities for people to gather together into communities. And then we add our platform, which is a social network platform, to each of these communities, and suddenly we have very, very focused networks, just as OilPro has created a network around the oil industry.
Yeah, and that was actually my next question. The taking the domain, obviously now you have a leverage point to create community. How do you do that? And I understand that PeopleBrowsr.co, that is something that you're pursuing. How does one do that? What is your social networking capability to create such a community?
So you go to nic.ceo, nic.ceo, which is the very, very first .co domain name, which is live right now. And on the 28th of March, it will become toplevel.ceo. You go there, you acquire your domain name, or you go to your favorite domain seller and you buy your .co domain name. And then as soon as you do, you get a welcome email which says, "Hey, Paul, welcome to your shiny new paul.ceo second level domain." And that then gives you access to the global network of CEOs who have also bought their own .co domain names. And it puts you in a fantastic position where you get access to other CEOs through the network, because PeopleBrowsr has built over the last 3 years this platform as a service that's a social network. And then on top of that, you can build your own paul.ceo network where you can invite your own friends and have your own network with your own look and feel.
Interesting. Which allows for sort of stratification, in both personal stratification and conceivably, one would think, the kind of stratification I talk about in terms of size of company or industry or what have you. Right.
Exactly. What's exciting about this, Paul, is that there are a number of really interesting changes happening in parallel. One of them is that consumers are being educated and they understand social networking and they understand how to publish their really interesting content. And then in parallel, the internet is changing and these new TLDs are coming out. And then again in parallel, enterprise and groups like the one you just mentioned, the retailer you just mentioned, are realizing that maybe it isn't just right to put everything in Facebook. Maybe we want to actually have some customer ownership and engagement directly in a container that we own ourselves. And so all these three things are converging in an incredibly interesting way.
Yeah, absolutely. The convergence is really quite astonishing. So in terms of, there are, as I'm sure you know, a fair amount of existing CEO-type networks out there, either on the ground, sort of physical, where you get together and you have a conference every now and then, you have dinners every now and then, and there are some, of course, that are on LinkedIn and other social networking sites. I mean, are those competition for this, or are they of almost no? I mean, based on what Scott said and the overall concept, are those are those competitors? Are those sort of not of interest, or is this a facilitation thing? What do you think?
I don't think they're competitors at all. In fact, I think they're partners. I think they're potential partners, and it's wonderful that CEOs have already, and we think there are hundreds of CEO groups out there, have already organized themselves, and they're potential partners. Every one of those CEOs should be, paulstukel.ceo or theirname.ceo, and every one of them needs a really efficient way of talking to each other. So we see ourselves as the infrastructure provider. We see ourselves as the identity and infrastructure provider, and that all of these groups out there are potential partners.
Be sure to check back for future episodes of the President and CEO Focus on the Middle Market podcast series. Thanks for listening.